Okay, everyone, I think we're going to start now. Sorry, we're just sorting out a bit of technology. Welcome to this session, part of the school fights strand at the Battle of Ideas, supported by the Times Education Supplement, TES, and the Institute of Ideas Education Forum. And this is a special discussion on one-to-one tuition and adopt the crisis in music schools. I say it's special because it's something which was discussed between myself and Tom from the Royal Philharmonic Society as being a very important, but let's be honest, tricky issue in relation to what has happened in music schools over recent years, and whether we could have a public discussion on it is always a bit nerve-wracking, because we're not particularly here to kind of have a discussion about sex abuse in music schools, but to actually look at the broader context. But there is an obvious backdrop of high-profile cases on sexual abuse, increasing and growing numbers of allegations, quite a large number now of police inquiries into specialist music schools and conservatoires in the country. And what we really want to unpick on this panel is to take a step back from what some people think is a panic or some people think is an appropriate response, but to look at whether this is going to have a damaging consequence on things like one-to-one tuition, because certain types of teaching require quite intimate relationships, and this kind of discussion, and if people are fearful, can alter the way we relate to that. I wanted a quote, which I've quoted before, but I think it's important. The Royal Philharmonic Society's Honorary Member, Rosemary Nalden, I hope I'm saying that right, who made a point recently that you cannot teach a stringed instrument without at some stage physically putting your hands on your pupil. And she went on to warn that the kind of work that she does in the shanty towns in South Africa, with very intensive music tuition, she didn't feel that she could organise that kind of school here in this country anymore because of the kind of risk-averse policy. So that's broadly the context in which we're talking, but it's not confined to a discussion on music schools, but actually a broader discussion about what's happening in education, relationships between adults and young people in educational settings. I'm really pleased that I've got this very fine panel. I really want to thank the RPS, who, if you were at the opening this morning, will also know commissioned a fanfare for the Battle of Ideas. It's the first time that we've ever actually had music composed for us, and it was very exciting, and it's to Tom's credit that he did that. It's the RPS's bicentenary, so thanks, Tom, for encouraging us to do this session. So I'm asking the speakers to talk for 5 to 7 minutes, sort of usual format, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll speak. So the first person we're going to hear from is Heather Piper, who has been and has worked in the past as a child text and social worker, but is now in academia. Is a professional research fellow at the Education and Social Research Institute at Manchester Met University. Most personally for this is the author of Researching Sex and Lies in the Classroom and Don't Touch, the Educational Story of a Panic. And her main research interests are the consequences of policy and practice premised on avoidance of all risk, and particularly as applied to the role of adults in loco parentis. So ideally placed to reflect on these issues. Next up then will be Piers Hallowell, who is a composer. He's actually speaking another session on the impact of technology in composition. He's a composer and professor of composition at Queen's University Belfast, and has been somebody we've had speak at the Battle of Ideas in the past. We're delighted to have him back. In April 2013, he won one of 20 PRS for Music Foundation biennial commissions to work with improvising I can't read that. Yes, improvising. Right, I can't read my own writing. It's always a bad sign. Anyway, he gets commissioned to do important things that I can't read. But the most important thing is his music has been described as, by The Independent, a large-scale palette applied with the most delicate brushwork, and by the Scotsman as gorgeously impassioned work a rich kaleidoscope of inspired creativity. So he's very much from the world of composition, so we just asked him to reflect on this as not necessarily somebody directly involved in tutoring, but has obviously considered the issues of music education over the years and has spoken at it at the Battle of Ideas. Then we will have Professor Frank Furedi, who has rushed from 2 previous sessions kind of non-stop and just been reflecting on history in schools, but now he's going to talk about this issue. He's the author of many books, but for now to note that he wrote Moral Crusades in an Age of Mistrust, the Jimmy Savile scandal, which he wrote earlier this year, for which I know, which I think is excellent, but which I know he took some flack from some people, because it's one of those areas you're not meant to discuss. He's also written one of the best books on education ever, which is called Wasted, Why Education is Not Educating, and other books such as Paranoid Parenting, Culture of Fear, and a new book being launched at the festival tomorrow called Authority, A Sociological History. He's an associate at the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent and visiting professor at the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction at UCL. Then we're going to hear from Tom Hutchinson, who I've already referred to, who is a clarinetist and a much sought after music teacher. He's also an arts project manager, obviously works with the Royal Philharmonic Society and has been coordinating their bicentenary events, and the fanfare was part of that, as you know. Apart from the RPS, Tom has also worked with over 60 arts organisations across the UK. In 2007, in fact, when I met him, he coordinated Hear Hear, explaining the subject of listening in music, which was presented by the RPS, Classic FM and the Paul Hamlin Foundation. He's currently working with filmmaker Ruth Paxton and a composer, just name I can't pronounce, on a new film and music collaboration for the new music biennial as part of the 2014 Commonwealth Games. And then the final speaker will be Dr. Sue Halam, who's actually returning to the festival, and previously spoke on Homework a few years ago, is here now as Professor of Education and Music Psychology at the Institute of Education, has been a professional musician and was involved in music education for many years, before taking up psychology studies and became an academic in 1991. She's the author of numerous books, but those, I suppose, pertinent are Instrumental Teaching, A Practical Guide to Better Teaching and Learning, The Power of Music, and Music Psychology and Education, and is editor of the Oxford Handbook of Psychology, Music and Music Education in 21st Century in the UK. Can we give a warm welcome to all of our speakers? Heather just wants to start off with a bit of a film.
Yeah, just going to show you a 3-minute short little bit off YouTube, which some of you may have seen, but it certainly warrants a second viewing in any case, I think.
When you're teaching instruments, there are times when you need to demonstrate particular techniques. In the past, this has often been done by touching students, but this can make students feel uncomfortable and can leave teachers open to accusations of inappropriate behaviour.
Well, wait a minute, what's the problem here, George?
I can't get the notes.
That's because your fingers and wrist aren't in the right position, so try it again. If you keep your fingers and wrist in the right position, you'll find it much easier and you won't even have to think about it. Look. Try it.
It isn't necessary to touch children in order to demonstrate. There's always a better way.
Okay, wait a minute. So, what's the problem here, George?
I can't get the notes.
It's because your fingers and wrist aren't in quite the right position. Okay, so try it again. Yeah, so, if you keep your fingers and wrist in the right position, you'll find it much easier. You won't even have to think about it. Let me show you. See how my wrist keeps this position? So that my fingers can reach the next notes easily. Okay? Have another go. Good. Good, much better. Okay, so you need to keep working on that. Keep that wrist nice and open.
You should never need to touch a student for demonstration. This can make students feel uncomfortable. It could lay you open to a charge of inappropriate behaviour. Use your creativity to find other, equally effective ways to demonstrate.
Heather.
Okay, I mean, I've been in sessions and shown this video numerous times, and the audience usually falls into two camps. Those that laugh themselves silly and think this is totally ridiculous, and those that think it's serious and something that we should be thinking about. Anyway, I'll obviously hear what your own views are later. But I think it more or less speaks for itself, and there's much more of this on YouTube. I think there's something like 100 or so such clips. This one is inappropriate communication of technique. It comes from Keeping Children Safe in Music, which was, I think, a 2010 campaign devised and promoted by the NSPCC, the Musicians Union, and various other illustrious organisations. And whilst this has been presented about being child protection, you will have no doubt noticed that it's clearly designed to terrify music teachers about the risk they pose and the risks that they face. And it's treating one-to-one tuition as self-evidently dangerous for both the teacher and the pupil. And the strong advice is, of course, to avoid touch at all costs. And the package and message only makes sense if it's first accepted that this teacher is intrinsically dangerous to the child. We might wonder why that any child would have that kind of response to an adult. Michael Gove criticised the alarmist nature of this campaign, because it's significant that even before the present storm hit music education, significant players were capable of acting like this. And since then, the storm has made it more difficult to remain calm and to make measured decisions. So I'll briefly summarise my own position, which is that people are being imperfect, there's always a risk of abuse, and it's always associated with differences in power. Including differences in age, expertise, fame, respect and so on. And such differences are no doubt characteristic of music tuition, and once any adult is seen as so brilliant as to be beyond criticism, there can be ground for rational concern. But these are not rational times, and child abuse is seldom considered rationally. And one type of abuse in particular, i.e. sexual, dominates discussion. And the false impression is given that children are particularly at risk from concerned expert adults who choose to work with them, while in fact children are more at risk from family members. But this has not stopped teachers, care workers, sports coaches, foster parents, and even children themselves, and now music specialists, being picked out as especially suspicious and dangerous. Organisations whose existence and financial health requires convincing the public that there is a problem and then selling the solution are always grateful for new targets and new territory to spread their influence. From my research with teachers, carers and sports coaches, the shape and progress of the current storm hitting music education this year has been grimly familiar, even predictable. A small number of serious cases, not usually current, are picked up and treated as if they're typical. The worst case event is then treated as the norm. All music teachers and instrumental tutors become suspect, anxiety rises, and the pressure is on for inquiries and to demonstrate reforms to policy and practice that will keep everybody safe. Typically, these confuse the protection of the child from abuse with the protection of the adult from suspicion. Opinion formers and self-interested experts pile in, keen to impose prescriptive and proscriptive solutions, as has happened in sports coaching, for example, where some coaches now feel unable to work under the regulatory regime imposed by their governing bodies, with huge inputs from the Child Protection Sport Unit, which is an arm of the NSPCC. And so I'm suggesting 3 responses to this storm for those who care about music education and instrumental teaching. Firstly, reject any change premised on the assumption that those who teach music are intrinsically dangerous to their pupils. Few instrumental teachers do the job so as to get near children, and it's demeaning and damaging for us all to act otherwise. Once this idea becomes internalised, adults doubt themselves and others and feel constrained to adopt self-defensive measures to demonstrate, or more accurately, to perform their propriety. And the outcome is anxious and joyless self-regulation, leading to impoverished and inflexible practice. Even worse, this mindset actually conceives a child as dangerous and a source of risk, and as a result, the adult-child teaching relationship becomes toxic. And secondly, reject the idea we can stop bad people doing bad things by stopping good people from doing good things. And so getting blameless and well-intentioned teachers to perform their risk-free status by always having their doors open and never touching a child unless they first have permission, filled in a risk assessment form and or have an audience, merely corrodes the trust and does not prevent abuse. All it does is diminish the quality of people's experience and reduce their educational benefit. Be especially aware of the phrase, even if it keeps just one child safe. It always comes with considerable collateral damage attached. And thirdly, reject the idea that touch is the issue or the problem. Touch itself is neutral, and nurturing touch is of course positive and essential in child development. And what matters is the context, motive and intent. And if the motive's good, then the practice of touch should be defended. So to sum up, rather than going down the route of defensive regulation, music educators should stand up for the virtues of their vocation and practice. Obviously all must be aware of the possibility of abuse and be brave in calling it what it is. But real safety will only be achieved through fostering a culture of wisdom, judgment, trust and openness, rather than spreading fear and preventing good practice. The right message to music teachers is simple: teach music to children but don't abuse them. You'll note that message wasn't part of the video we just saw. Alongside this, communication with potential pupils and their parents needs to explain that it can be wholly appropriate for an instrumental teacher to touch a child, and this should not be confused with abuse. And none of this, of course, precludes making it clear abuse is unacceptable and must be reported. There's enough understanding and respect for music teaching among parents and the public to suggest that a brave response to this crisis of confidence will be rewarded. Calm judgment is needed to avoid throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Some will now expect music education to accept its prime purpose is safeguarding, but this isn't the case. Actually, its raison d'etre is music education, which is why I would argue there should be no place for crude campaigns like the one we saw at the start on the video at the start of this session.
Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Very uncompromising but very clear. Thank you. Piers.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to echo a good deal of what Heather said, I think. Firstly, the fact that in the face of something as terrible as this, the difficulty is that, well, the difficulty is our revulsion, which is absolutely right, but I think that rage probably doesn't make good policy, and so in a sense we have to have our anger, but also have a cool head in terms of what the implications of this are, which is what the Institute of Ideas asked us about. I should sort of out myself as not having a background in institutions at all. I didn't go through the conservatoire system or specialist music school or anything. And as a result, I feel extremely diffident about wading in. But also, I think that the music profession is in a way kind of riven between those who, who sadly have experience of this environment in my generation, and those of us who don't. Particularly universities, in which I earn my day crust, in the music in universities, I think is largely ignorant of this, and we're still playing catch up. And so, for those reasons, I feel very hesitant. But at the same time, when I speak to the the performer musicians that I work with all the time, I'm aware that there's a culture that just simply I don't know about. That when the subject comes up, there's a kind of a clouding and a kind of right that. And it's gradually dawning on me, the enormity of an experience that other people have, and I feel sort of hesitant to, to comment on that anyway. Obviously, lots of us here maybe have not been through a conservatoire system like me, but I do think all of us, perhaps 98% of us, have probably learned an instrument at some time, even though it's just a few guitar lessons or something. So, in a way, we have social ownership of the situation that we saw in the film. So, I'm going to go with that rather than think about, the culpability of the institutions, which I don't know about. I visit them as either a visiting composer or an external examiner, and neither of those capacities tends to encourage institutions to kind of bear their negative sides to them. So I haven't had that experience. The first thing I want to say is just that music as a learning area, I think, makes greater demands on trust than almost any other area of human interaction. And just to qualify what sounds like an absolutely lead-booted platitude, because I realise that that's a truism, I don't mean the trust just in terms of that we present our child for flute lessons and expect them not to be abused. But what I mean is that those of us who teach in music tend particularly to make demands whose raison d'etre, benefit, whatever, may not be apparent to the learner in the same way as maybe somebody trying to help a child run faster or something like that. I mean, we all know that most teenagers are not mad about practicing lots of scales, and most teachers encourage them to, although not all. In my area, which is training composers to turn into themselves, I might ask them to, maybe to work out a long string of notes united by some kind of the distance between them, or I might think somebody needs to work out a set of chords with notes shared between them or something, and that would be on the basis of what I have seen before and think might help them open up their own area. And so in a sense they're looking to me to be sort of further up the hill and looking further out viewpoint wise, and that's what teaching is. I don't have a problem with that, but it means that we are trusted in music teaching, not just with things that are self-apparent, but trusted to go with tasks that may not seem to be immediately kind of desirable or whatever. And therefore, I think anything that loses that trust, in the way that Heather commented as well, is terribly negative. I mean, I think it is better for a child not to have tuition than to be put into a situation where there is any kind of colouring of that almost sacred relationship. I mean, I'm thinking back to a friend of mine who's an amateur musician, very keen amateur musician, told me that the relationship with her fiddle teacher when she was a teenager was so intense in an absolutely non-leading way, completely not talking about anything. She said it was more intense than that with her parents or that with her boyfriend. She said it was so they were so into what they were doing, and that is what we're dealing with, and that's why these are such dangerous and unquantifiable areas. We're dealing with something that's extremely precious and extremely vulnerable, and I think much of our revulsion comes from the importance of trust that the person prescribing knows what they're doing. I mean, I send my own child to 3 things a week with individuals, and I know them very well, probably don't know them as well as I think, and they certainly don't know me as well as they think. But at the same time, I think when I'm putting the child into that situation, I'm delighted with what she's getting from it, and I'm trusting that environment. And I think if you don't have that sort of feeling, it's very frightening. So I think it's important. For that reason, I'm extremely reluctant to have any kind of solutions of the sort that Heather also expressed reservations about in terms of legislation. I think we cannot start from the assumption that this is a bad place to be, that music is beware of abuse if you're doing music. I think that's very, very bad. I think what we have to do is encourage an environment of consultation and sensitivity by the individual teacher. Some press comment has centred on kind of individual codes of practice where people may be asked to touch, say, I'm going to have to show you, can I move your elbow to show you? I think that's right. What I like about that is the individual responsibility. There is absolutely no future in dropping a huge lump of concrete on thousands and thousands of hapless and entirely blameless music teachers as some kind of legislation from on high. But I think that what is much more important and much more likely to work is changing a culture from within that. I mean, this happens in many walks of life, and I think, as it's already been said, most teachers would already be doing that for themselves and having policies of not doing lessons at home and that kind of thing. But legislation, you know, in itself, kind of attacks the honest and, you know, the same way as a locked front door keeps everybody out except a burglar. So it seems to me that there is no future in some kind of, you know, hastily convened policy. Finally, I just wanted to comment on something which has been in the press and also been said to me privately by musicians, that this goes far more widely than sex. I think the idea of abuse, which is after all the disfiguring of a legitimate relationship, is absolutely found, or has been found, in the way in which individual figures have set themselves up as, have tended to kind of impose a sort of monistic approach to hapless students. In my field, the mantra is that there are no right or wrong answers in composition, there's only context. Something may be the right or wrong thing to do here. You cannot legislate, and anybody who tries to make you do what they do is a dangerous lunatic and certainly should be avoided. And so the idea of an identity, a set of views being imposed by a teacher, I definitely think is a kind of abuse in its extreme cases. Think of a couple of celebrated stories in connection with this, which I'll keep for later, but just to say that if a sense of humility is necessary for the learning of music, and I certainly think it is, my God, how important sense of humility is for teachers of music, much more important.
Thank you very much, Chris. So, the interesting raising of some broader issues there, which I'll come back to you on, but Frank, your thoughts?
Right. Well,
sorry. Yeah.
In one sense, this discussion is totally academic, because there's no doubt about it that the whole area of teaching music one-to-one is going to be more and more regulated. That's the temper of our times, and you cannot really stop it. And the reason why you cannot really stop it is because it's got nothing to do with teaching of music. And that's the important thing. You have to remember that music teachers may experience this development as something that's kind of driven from within the sphere of music teaching. That's how you experience it, because there are a few cases here and there that have come up. But actually there's a powerful cultural current which demonizes any form of one-to-one relationship in any domain of social experience. And I think that that's the way that life is now. What we really are worried about is not the teaching of music, not even the holding of a child, it's the one-to-one. I think it's the one-to-one, because ultimately what is really at stake here is that contemporary Western culture, particularly in its Anglo-American form, is extremely uncomfortable with intimacy, with closeness in any of its dimensions. We have a health warning, so that everything from love is now a risk to any kind of close encounter is increasingly seen as a form of codependency. We have a number of psychological labels that we've developed that try to medicalize those kinds of relationships. It's often posed as being unhealthy, and in sociology we've got a concept that we use to describe this development, which is that of cultural cooling, where people are told to cool, we tell children, we have this horrible expression, peer-to-peer relation, which used to be called your mates. We tell them to keep a distance from each other, any kind of sexual activity with a teenager is being recast as unwanted. There's always an assumption of pressure. And of course, as you know, in any one-to-one relationship, there's always pressure, otherwise there would be a relationship. And these things don't just happen to a mystical act of God. So I think it's important to realize that this has got nothing to do with music at all, but it's got to do with much wider pressures, to do with our society's inability to culturally value intimacy and understand the importance that it has. And I think it's a very important point here, because it just so happens that in music this comes out very clearly. Obviously music involves subjectivity. I mean, it's a very subjective interaction. It's not like teaching chemistry in a laboratory where you can measure and calculate stuff. It involves emotions. I mean, it's very difficult to switch off emotionally when you're involved in music. And again, emotion, as we all know, is not something that you can contain within little vessels. And my anger is here, my love is here, and the rest of that. It's a much more ambivalent, fluid kind of process. And sometimes music, certainly from what I understand as an outsider, because I'm a total outsider, involves passion. There's a kind of passionate dynamic there, which you kind of sense, you know, sort of, because as you're breaking down the aesthetic and the emotional and the different boundaries in that kind of intense kind of experience, you know, we have certain feelings that catches us unaware. When I talk to people that are musicians or are involved in that kind of rough area, you know, the language they use when they talk to me one-to-one is really about that kind of, you know, you kind of going along and wham, bam, you kind of find yourself going in the most unexpected of directions. Very difficult to regulate that, because obviously if you're involved in a relationship which involves music, it's very difficult to have clear signposts. If you do, then of course you end up teaching, I don't know, compositional skills maybe, but not composition. You end up having to break down the thing to very kind of discrete, kind of limited kind of compartments. So the point I want to emphasize is that what you're experiencing in music is also what we all experience. I, as an academic in a university, are now told not to get too close to my students. Not to, you know, to teach every student the same. I mean, it's a horrific idea. It's meant to be very inclusive that you teach every student the same, but of course, any good teacher will refuse to teach every student the same, because you know that some students you want to put pressure on, others you want to, you know, almost, you know, metaphorically hug and comfort, and there's differential attitude, and there are different days you adopt different strategies. But now we have this attitude that there's something inherently wrong in the closeness that comes with this. And I think, you see, you know, when I came here, I said, well, should I get involved in the discussion about that video? Because I saw that video. And I think the thing I was really horrified by, because it was actually true, is the reaction of that little boy. Because I think children, I've got a kid, and children are basically instructed at a very early age to react that way. When I was a child, I would have just taken that as a reassurance. You know, I mean, really nice, this guy is giving me a hug. Now, you know, young boys, young girls growing up will see that as a marker of abuse. I mean, anybody that touches you like that, you know, and that's because we are estranged from this. But I don't want to get involved in the debate, because I actually think that there must be more than one way of teaching music. I mean, human beings are extremely creative, you know, sort of, and if they can pull it, I'm sure there must be another way of doing it, because over the centuries we developed all kinds of strategies, pedagogic kind of strategies for dealing with these things. The reason why I'm not interested in this, because I actually don't think the issue is one of physical proximity. If that was, it was merely a question of policing physical contact, then this discussion would be, you know, not as high stake as it really is. Because I think the stakes here are not about physical contact. That's very important, and Heather does some wonderful, you know, kind of work on it. But it's also a more fundamental one, a more existential one. And that brings me back to where I should have begun my talk. I was reading, I don't know if any read Plato's Phaedrus. It's a wonderful little kind of discussion, but basically Plato is kind of questioning writing. He's basically saying that he's very uncomfortable in writing because it's very passive. You know, sort of, it doesn't answer back. You know, sort of, it can, you know, it treats everybody the same. Everybody picks it up. It tells the same kind of story to it. What he's really saying is, I've got a far greater opinion of rhetoric. You know, because when you speak, you can challenge me. When we speak, you can debate with each other. And in that kind of a context, what you have is what he calls a dialectic, a kind of an interaction element. And then when he turns to Phaedrus, he says, kind of takes this pause, and he says, and of course, you know what we're really trying to do here, in kind of clarifying matters and seeking the truth. You know, what a good, you know, sort of communicator really tries to do, and he uses this expression, is to touch the soul. We're trying to touch the soul. And I thought a really wonderful expression that he's using, touching the soul. This is what a teacher does. He basically says, teachers don't try to convince. That's what politicians do and rhetoricians do. What a teacher does is it tries to touch and then direct the soul. And I think in different ways, any really good teacher will try to do that, even when you're not aware of that. And I think that what we're really discussing here is this estrangement, you know, from allowing our souls to be touched. Right? It's that what we're very uncomfortable with. And I think all this fear of abuse, all this pathologization of adult-child relationships, you know, the normalization of abuse is really an attempt to reconcile ourselves to a world where the touching of the soul becomes a no-go area. And that's why it's a high-stake discussion. Nothing to do with music, it just so happens that it's in your area that it really kicks in big time.
Thank you, Frank, and nice bit of existentialism there, a bit of classics. Tom?
Thanks. One-to-one tuition is vital to many practices, but particularly to learning an instrument. Learning an instrument is complex and a long undertaking. Having been with my instrument, the clarinet, for over 20 years, and having taught it for 15 years, I never tire of discovering the depth of challenges it brings and witnessing how many of my students tackle these themselves in different ways. I advocate that learning an instrument is one of the best pursuits to follow for youngsters, as it combines the physical, intellectual and emotional worlds together, not to mention the range of skills and dedication it develops. To achieve this, and to take it to a high level, student musicians need a dedicated environment of a one-to-one lesson. The detail and attention required to cover all of the bases, be it holding the instrument, intonation, phrasing, technique, etc., demands this. Indeed, at many stages, the work is tough. Coupled with music's emotive power, and perhaps a pupil's turbulent social and personal world outside the teaching room, particularly during adolescence, means that a strong, positive, trusting relationship is often developed between pupil and teacher, much more so than in the class situation. Of course, for instrumental study and other activities, e.g. drama or sports, the group class lesson has its benefits. The exchange of knowledge and opinion, social engagement, and the sharing of experience are all incredibly important, but are a necessary supplement, not replacement, to the individual lesson. My childhood was dominated by one-to-one tuition, and how lucky I feel to have had those opportunities and a range of dedicated, caring, and exceptionally knowledgeable teachers. How sad it is then, over the past year, to have witnessed from within the profession the revelations, accusations, convictions, and tragedies that bring us to this debate today. The one-to-one model, being on the whole private, personal, intimate, concentrated, can be open to abuse. But I would like to emphasise that this is not confined solely to the musical world. Abuse, be it physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, psychological, can happen in many different areas. It is as likely to happen in swimming coaching or in a personal tutorial or even at home as it is in a music lesson. Abuse is the antithesis of teaching, and without doubt, any form of abuse must be stopped and the perpetrator dealt with. I remember vividly being alerted by social media of the Guardian newspaper releasing the RNCM dossier, being stunned at the volume of correspondence, and that the situation the RNCM had faced had not been, in my opinion, dealt with in the appropriate manner. What is even more distressing is the common response that everyone knew what was happening. If a substantial body of evidence exists, I find it hard to accept that an institution would tolerate continuing the employment of a member of their staff who had been abusive or behaved inappropriately towards students. And I clarify that I do just not mean relation to younger students, e.g. under 16. There is a professionalism that exists for a teacher which should not be compromised at higher education establishments too. Many of the recent allegations have been historic. This does not diminish their significance or ability to shock, not least for the family of Francis Andrade. But I remain optimistic that the health of music teaching in the UK, be it in specialist music schools or within music centres and local music hubs, is first rate. I trust that the institutions facing allegations will thoroughly investigate these, though I am less certain that a national public inquiry will be beneficial or is even necessary. Perhaps we can be thankful that we now live in an age that is open to acknowledging that abuse does happen and that we can face this and hopefully tackle it in some way. The other side of the coin, however, is that mass hysteria and panic set in. For the past few weeks, I've been in New York for the Royal Philharmonic Society bicentenary celebrations. Colleagues at the Juilliard School eagerly told me how they were following the vast coverage of the allegations. That same week, I saw the beginning of season 3 of American Horror Story entitled Coven. The opening scenes of witches being burned at the stake chimed with all of this recent media coverage. As the Danish film Chetham, directed by Thomas Vinterberg, demonstrates, it is all too easy for allegations to spread to something more sinister. Now is not the time for crucible-esque proceedings. Maintaining standards, adequate checks and balances, and transparency is key. Apart from the basic procedures in place, such as references, CRB checks, and windows indoors, I think it is reasonable to say that regular monitoring and assessment of teachers by sitting in on lessons is useful. Not in an inquisitorial, dare I say, Ofsted manner, but one which is fostering a development in teaching practice. I make it very clear to parents that they may sit in on any lessons they wish, which actually really can be a benefit to the student if someone at home has some knowledge too. I have just been made a trustee of the National Children's Orchestra of Great Britain, and in the summer had the wonderful opportunity of spending time with our training orchestra, open to string players aged 7 to 10. What struck me was not only the quality of their sound and music making, but their community-like enthusiasm during rehearsals and breaks. It was a philharmonic village in action. We have much to be proud of our music education in this country, so I hope that the profession will learn from these recent experiences, not allow certain individuals to tarnish this good work, and that we will be debating a more uplifting subject next year.
Thank you, Tom. Very thoughtful, very thought-provoking as well. So finally, Sue, your thoughts?
Yes, I think, excuse me, I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective to this. First of all, as having been a professional musician and trained through the system, as having been then a teacher, and also now in my current position as somebody who does research in education and music psychology in particular. First of all, I think we're confounding several issues here. One, there is the issue of one-to-one teaching as opposed to other kinds of teaching, group teaching, sectional rehearsals, coaching, and so on and so forth. That is one issue. And the second issue is to do with what happens in lessons. Touching, whether we can find other ways of doing that, because touching doesn't just apply to individual one-to-one lessons. If you've taught in groups, as I have, the same issues apply, so they are separate issues. And then there's this third issue about abuse and grooming, and it seems to me that they've got kind of mixed up in what we're talking about. So if I go back to one-to-one tuition as opposed to other kinds of tuition in music, I'd absolutely agree with Tom that one-to-one tuition is important, but it's not the only way that people can learn. We learn all the time, all of us. And learning in music is no different to that. For instance, when I started to learn to play the violin, I started in a group of 12. And then on my way to going to the Royal Academy of Music, at various points in time, had individual lessons, sometimes group lessons, lots of other musical activities, from playing in quartets and being coached, sectional rehearsals in orchestra, actually playing in orchestra, doing things independently, and so on. So while individual tuition is important, it is not the only way that you can learn to play music. And I think one of the issues around some of the problems we're perhaps facing at the moment, and we heard, is that some of the relationships that develop between teachers and pupils can be unhealthy, even if they don't lead to any abuse as such. Being in a situation where your teacher is so dominant in your life is actually not necessarily a very healthy thing for when you want to go into the music profession, when your teacher won't be there anymore, and you need to be independent in your decisions that you make about music, your playing, your career, and so on. The second point I'd like to make about teaching one-to-one and in groups is the quality of the teaching. Because actually students might be better off learning in a group with a very, very good teacher than learning individually with a very poor teacher. So the quality of the teaching and also their professionalism is a very important issue in all this. And one of the, I was giving a keynote at a conference a few weeks ago in Amsterdam, which was looking at nurturing talent and also identifying talent. And from that conference, which was across different disciplines, so it was music, it was dance, it was sport, there were neuroscientists there, various groups of people, and one of the absolutely key messages that came out of that was that if we want to spot talent, the only way we can do that is through giving people the opportunity to engage with things. Because there aren't any tests of musical ability or dance or whatever that you can dish out to select people. You need to give them the chance, and that inevitably means, particularly in the current economic climate, that there's going to have to be some group teaching in order then to identify the children who are sufficiently motivated to go on. And the second thing that came out of that was that the people who succeed in music are motivated absolutely and completely. It is their total life, and that they are constantly striving to be better, and they will look for ways to do that, whether it is in further individual tuition or advice from a professional or some other activity, whatever that is. Now, the second thing, I've already touched on this, is touching in lessons. This is not something which is, just for one-to-one tuition. If you're teaching in a group, as we saw in the violin lesson there, teachers may want to go around, and if children have got their wrists like that, and I was a violinist, and you may want to do that. Actually, in my own experience, doing that doesn't actually help, because what you've really got to do is get the child to realise that this is what is going wrong and take it on board and actually engage with it. And I remember one particular student I had who I'd struggled with for ages, and in the end, in desperation, brought in a video camera and videoed him, and then when he could see what it looked like and what the impact on his playing, he stopped immediately. So I think, we can be creative about not touching. It's not, I don't think it is absolutely essential. And then the third thing is this whole issue of abuse. And if we abolished individual tuition tomorrow, and there was no individual tuition in any place at all, we would still have abuse. We have to remember that. In any context, this is not just to do with music. In my institution, we have very clear guidelines, and my institution, by the way, is totally for postgraduate students. We have a very small number of undergraduates, but they're nearly all postgraduate, and we still have guidelines about how staff should behave with students, individual tuition, the door may be left open. You can't do that in music, but you can have glass panels and so on. And we have very clear procedures, if people complain and things like that. And music needs to get its act together, actually, institutions, to ensure that they've got proper systems in place for dealing with this. And it seems to me that a lot of what has gone wrong is that institutions have not had those things in place. A lot of it is historical. We all know that historically, there was a different culture. But we are now in a different place, and whether it's a school for primary school, secondary, music specialist, conservatoire, university, whatever, need to have procedures, proper policies, proper procedures, and proper actions that are taken if things go wrong. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue. Now, I've got loads of things that I want to ask you, but I think I'm going to go, or characteristically for me, straight out to the audience, get a few things in, and then I'll weave them into things I want to talk about, because I know that there's people anxious to speak. So there's the gentleman there with the, so there's a gentleman there with the white hair, now come up to the front. Yeah, so there's two there and then one in the front, yeah.
Okay.
So wait till the microphone arrives for you, thank you.
Hello, my name's John Bridgett. I've just 2 points I wanted to make. One is that the Royal College of Music in the 1920s, they had door practice rooms with windows, which were presumably used to check up that pupils were doing their proper practice. Vaughan Williams, who was a professor there, they didn't have lifts in those days, used to climb the 6 flights up to the top of the Royal College of Music in order to look at a girl he particularly fancied in one of the practice rooms, and then walked all the way down again. That's one thing I just mentioned in passing. But more seriously, my wife is a piano teacher, and what she tells me is that the one-to-one tuition in music is so rare, I mean, in the sense that it doesn't apply in almost any other discipline. And what she finds she is doing, and she values enormously, and she feels her pupils value, is that half the time she is being a counsellor stroke advisor, and because it's the one opportunity that the pupils have to talk to someone who is outside their family and who they can rely on to give advice. And I think that's a very precious thing that music tuition offers, and we shouldn't forget that. I mean, of course I take the point about group teaching is very valuable, but there is music one-to-one tuition is offering a social function as well as a musical one.
Okay, just to kind of raise this, because obviously we're not kind of here to work out a policy on one-to-one tuition, because I think the context is obviously as well quite broad, because group or one-to-one, I mean, people have said this, touch or no touch, it's more a question of why the things like no-touch policy are coming. It's not that they're coming because everybody's been creative, it's because of a defensive thing, do you know what I mean? So, you know, if you've got no touch of that stuff, it's that sort of thing, whether you've got group, you know, so it's this, I suppose it's like working out how we got into a situation whereby anyone would even think that, you know, taking a particular interest in a child, showing that because you think developing an intimate relationship with them as a music teacher might be grooming, that's the sort of thing that we immediately start querying instead of anything else. So I suppose that's what I'm trying to dig into. So the gentleman there, then here, then there. Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to just lead on from that previous contribution, but first it's not just music teaching, as people have already identified. You should try correcting a screw kick whilst just wearing your trunks in the swimming pool, and the relationship that puts you with, and you really do need to manipulate a screw kick because kids can't necessarily see it when they're doing breaststroke. I think the video was dead interesting because it was slightly disingenuous because the second bit was much more empathic. You know, there was little language kind of traits that made him a more sympathetic teacher. But there were three people in that room. There was the third person who was making the teacher act slightly out of character, and that destroys authority. That particular relationship then changes once you're not being yourself. And when I was brought into a children's home a while back to develop behaviour management strategies, and the first thing I did to the staff was say to them, I trust you, I will back you as long as you're, you know, I'm assuming that your approach to these young people is on the side, you've all been vetted, etc. No matter what you do, even if you get it wrong, I will back you. So I gave them back their authority, and that started, that took the third person out of the scenario in that sense, and that was working quite well until the external manager was replaced, who completely disagreed with my strategy. So then I was completely undermined. So it's important to get that. The relationship is that close relationship, and that's where all the other things can flourish, but only if the third person, third party isn't there.
Okay, thank you. So I've got this person here, then there. And then I'll come back to the panel just for quick comments or anything you want to say to each other. Yeah.
A quick comment on actually looking at the video. The bit I found most uncomfortable and most sad was not the arm around the child, but the child looking at the teacher over his shoulder, and that seemed to be symptomatic of a total change in society, which is utterly corrosive in my view, and that is of creating a suspicion in small children that all adults are potential dangers. And there was a sort of correlation some years ago with feminism, where a lot of feminists said that some men rape, therefore all men are rapists, and this was a terrible correlation. The other thing I noticed was Frank was talking about we are uncomfortable in the West about intimacy. And just as an observation about a society which I think is totally muddled, is at the same time we have this suspicion and worry about intimacy, particularly adults and children. Through social media, Facebook, the actual younger generation are exposing themselves on every intimate aspect of their lives, and sexting and all the rest of it. So you just have a sort of paradox where one's fanatic about teachers touching someone, and yet the young are growing into this world where that is always what they're encouraged to do.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. My name's Ian Pace. I've been a campaigner on this issue, and I've listened to what everyone had to say with a certain amount of incredulity. I listened to what Heather Piper, how she describes things. I'd say she portrays the situation as relatively minimal, a few isolated historic cases. Now, if we were to look at Chetham School of Music, which I attended, in terms of the allegations I've heard and been in contact with a lot of victims, these involve over 30 teachers, past and present, and between 2 or 3 times that number of victims. Some teachers with as many as 20 or 30 different victims. And that's just dealing with sexual abuse. When it comes to other forms of abuse, then the numbers rise very, very significantly. Also, bullying of victims by other staff and some house parents to stop them going forward. Of epidemics of self-harm, of students going on hunger strike and suicide attempts. At one point, half the girls in 1 year all attempting suicide, and most of them were expelled as a result. And as far as allegations about the other specialist music schools and conservatoires are concerned, some of which are documented in the public domain, these are little better and in some cases even worse. The majority of people who go through specialist music schools and also conservatoires do not go on to be professional musicians. There simply aren't the jobs available. Many of those do indeed have the motivation that Sue Halam mentioned, and they afterwards go through years of chronic self-doubt, depression, suicide attempts. And I believe those people are every bit as much the responsibility of the institutions as those who go on to make a success and who they make much of in their publicity. And Frank Furedi mentioned intimacy. I'd like to mention a recurrent type of example that I've often heard about various different teachers. This will involve teachers faced with a student maybe aged 13 or 14 and saying to them, I can make you into a really special musician, but I need your trust. You have to show to me that you can really trust me. If you don't have that trust, we can't go any further. And that leads to such things as, now, if I asked you to strip naked in front of me in this lesson, would you do that to show me how much you trust me? And that is not just an isolated case. I've heard that many times. And I've heard even of strategies in this respect coming from several teachers, to the extent I even wonder if they might share secrets and share strategies. Is that the sort of intimacy that Frank Furedi wants to allow? Is that what touching the soul is about? And I hear these contributions from, and except for one, I think these are contributions which many abusers would be very happy to hear.
Thank you, Ian. It's actually interesting, because I have often said to people, I can make you into a very special, not musician, everyone will be relieved to know, very special pupil, so on, all you have to do is trust me. I think that's an entirely appropriate teaching method, mentoring, guidance, and generally is not followed by, and now will you strip off. It's followed by years and years and years of trying to turn a young person into what they could be and releasing their potential. And some of them are here organising this festival, but maybe that's sinister too, who knows. Anyway, anyone else before I see if the panel want to reply? That gentleman there, and then I'll see the panel, and then I'll go to you next, yeah?
I was just going to say I'm slightly perplexed by all of the focus on the touching, especially in the video, because are we to believe that by correcting someone's bow hold, this might, somewhere down the line, lead to abuse? When people who are in these positions of trust and want to abuse them, regardless of whether everyone's told that they can't correct someone's bow hold?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so who wants to start? Sue. Sue, then.
First of all, on the question of touching, I mean, singers, wind players, there are huge amounts of issues about breathing. Do I need to go further? And I know from my own experience at school, particularly with colleagues, I didn't play a wind instrument, I was a violinist, but colleagues again, who frankly, you know, teachers behaved inappropriately to do with issues about breathing. So it is important, but we need to keep it in perspective. The second thing is, you know, these power relationships are very, very powerful, and some of the teachers, I mean, I'll tell you a story about what happened to me, and this is a long time ago now, and certainly I did not complain, but it was not uncommon for my violin teacher to teach at his house. He asked me to go to his house one evening because, you know, we constantly change things. When I got there, his wife, his daughter, his housekeeper were all out, and after the lesson, he asked me, he said, "Oh, we've worked really hard, Sue. I think I deserve a little reward." Now, at this point in time, I was in my last year at the academy. I was engaged to be married. He knew my fiancé, and I was out of that door as fast as lightning. I was a very, you know, I knew what I was at. But I can see, and I know from other female musicians, that this kind of thing was endemic at that time. And from what's coming out now, it looks like it was endemic everywhere. And most of us, given what you're saying, you know, you're going to go into the music profession. These people can damage your career. You know, it's not trivial. And so, you know, you managed it. You know, I mean, I was at a really difficult point. I didn't know whether to change teacher or not. I was very near the end, and I didn't change. But he was very aware that I was absolutely furious, and you know, it really made a difference. But not everybody was, you know, in my position that confident to handle it.
Frank.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult discussion because a lot of what we're discussing is going through the prism of our own personal experiences. And the way we experience, well, you just spent a not inconsiderable time talking about your personal experience. Maybe I misinterpreted and it's got a universal kind of context to it. But what happens is that it's very easy to make a little jump from our personal experience to interpreting in a particular way and then to use, as you said, the word endemic. Now, it's interesting because these kind of problems seem to be endemic, not just in music teaching, not just in sports, not just in schools, not just in universities, not just in the workplace, but in all domains of social experience. And as a sociologist, I asked myself, how could it be that all of a sudden we have an epidemic, a literal epidemic, and use the word epidemic, in all these different areas? Was it the case that for centuries we just didn't acknowledge what was really kind of going on?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Or is it maybe the case that people sort of interpret things in line with different cultural assumptions and different kind of cultural kind of reactions? And it seems to me that when we begin to go down that road, what we are really saying, what you're saying, is actually you find it very difficult to trust other people in intensely close kind of environments. And it's not anybody's fault in this room, because we've adopted a narrative and a language that disposes us in this direction. Take, for example, a concept that we now use. When I was a child, the only context in which we ever used the word grooming was what cats did. Sort of, and a very kind of clear, specific kind of meaning. Now, just reflect on the word grooming, because now all you need is somebody to use the word, this person has been arrested for grooming. Hasn't actually done anything, but has been arrested for grooming. Now, grooming, where I come from, actually means the cultivation of a relationship. Right? A long-term cultivation, where you're making an emotional or other investment in the relationship. And in the course of doing that, you might have malevolent motives, as no doubt some people do. You might have on the opposite extreme worthy motives. And it seems to me that it's a very subjective thing what it really is, but the very fact that ipso facto, it's got to be seen as a marker of abuse, and it's got to be seen as a crime, says to me that actually people's worldview has become really screwed up, where they continually rediscover, sort of the annihilation of their existence in all kinds of circumstances, and normalize that. And myself, I don't want to live in that world. The world you're describing is not the world that I live in, sort of, and if it was, sort of, I really would rather not, I would kind of probably go to Switzerland very, very fast and finish it off, because that's not the world of the real human beings that I know, who make their way and who are trustworthy, who I don't mind if my child goes anywhere near them, sort of, and I don't think that institutions are endemically, there's no institutions that are endemic like that. There's a lot of institutions, a lot of powerful people who are abusers, but they aren't, they don't constitute the norm, and we don't have to reinterpret our life in accordance with their disposition. We can have a different life that we choose for ourselves.
Okay, now I know Heather wants to come in. I don't know if anyone else was at this stage or whether I go back out, so you can let me know. But Heather, and then I'll start with you. So.
Added to that, which I agree with wholly, is this conflation of the past with the present. And when you say you're talking about, for example, going back to the comment about 30 teachers and more, I mean, if we're talking about the time, I suspect we're talking about the law was different for one thing, which makes the whole difference.
One has been arrested who was teaching in February this year.
Yes, that's one.
Yeah.
You
And
said
there's also
30
such
or
a thing
more.
as innocent
So
until
there's-
guilty.
yeah,
Until
and so there's the problem about, we have this problem about assuming just because there are so many complaints made that they're all true, and experience shows us that that's not the case. They won't all turn out to be true, some will and some won't. So we can't use these figures as facts because they're not facts, they're unproven. But certainly talking about what happened 30 years, sorry, 25 or 30 years or whenever ago, and pretending it's today doesn't actually help the position we're in today. It doesn't help us move forward, it just turns it into some kind of hysterical discussion about how bad things were, which I don't think helps.
So the victims are still around 30 years afterwards.
Yeah. People who accuse people are not necessarily victims. You have to untangle things, Ian. Yes, good. So that young gentleman there, and then the lady behind.
Thank you. My name is Dick Short. Forgive the potential ad hominem here, but I perhaps think you've misinterpreted his words. He was, as an instrumental student myself, I completely and utterly agree with what Frank has said. You can't learn music without having some sort of physical, sort of emotional engagement with it. But with your under your interpretation, that sort of impersonal engagement was sort of taken out of context and derailed a bit. My question to the panel is: what limit would you put on the engagement of a student within music?
Okay, thank you.
What limit? What would you deem as being sort of off limits in terms of an emotional engagement with music?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Good but difficult question. God knows. That lady there.
I agree wholeheartedly that we must try not to conflate what's happened in the past with how we move forward in a constructive way now. But I think we have to look at what's happened in the past to move forward constructively. And if we go back to the issue of Chetham's, I was also a pupil there in the 1980s and 1990s, and I can assure you, as Ian has said, and as I think as Sue would agree, sexual abuse was endemic. Members of staff did know about it. Nothing was done. The police have described the situation to me as being rife in the school during that time, and various other people I've spoken to said there was a systematic madness to the way that abuse went on in that school. So it's very difficult for those of us, and I understand this is coming from a personal point of view, but it's very difficult for those of us who've waited for 25 years for this to come out, to sit here and listen to people say, this is a witch hunt. Because actually, unless we address these issues and look at them properly and see what went wrong and move forward and make music education catch up and ensure there are policies to ensure children are safely looked after, then we can't have meaningful discussion about the situation. We need to look at what's gone on in the past to make sure these things don't happen again.
I think you maybe appreciate that as you're calling for empathy in relation to the people who were at Chetham's in the past and the circumstances in which you have described, that it's also can be quite frustrating if you're trying to, I don't mean at this particular debate here today, but partly, I mean it, when you try and open up a discussion on when you're worried about the consequences of things getting out of hand, and there are things as witch hunts, and there are people who are falsely accused, as well as people who are abused, and so on, and all of these things, and the rule of law. But it's very difficult when you have that, where the immediate response from some people is to sort of infer that you are the kind of people who are apologists for paedophiles. No, I didn't say you. No, I'm not saying that. I'm trying to stop everyone being offensive. Right. What I'm saying is, if you're in a conversation, so all I'm saying is, I don't think you can anymore say it's very difficult to hear people say it's a witch hunt. It might be, but it's also quite feasible it is one. Just because it's difficult to hear it, it doesn't mean it isn't true any more than things in the past. So I think that one of the reasons of trying to open this discussion up is so that people don't set themselves up in those camps.
Okay, so we need to entertain the possibility that it's not a witch hunt in that case.
Yeah, no, these things are arguments, real ferocious, with a lot at stake arguments. The thing that I was going to ask, actually, the audience, but also the panel to reflect on, because this is beyond music schools, so I don't want to get trapped on just that, is a lot of child protection policies now, and I know that you referred to this, Heather, are more about protecting teachers from reputations. It's kind of risk aversion. I think that's the greatest betrayal, because your point about what are the limits, if everybody thinks that they might be accused, and even that video was saying, this is for your own good, don't do it in case somebody accuses you, it seems to me a potential great betrayal for young people everywhere, or adults walking around thinking that pupils, music or otherwise that they teach, might accuse them, and therefore are kind of backing off, because it seems to me there will be no interpersonal engagement between the generations, and socialisation of generations, which is adults' responsibility, could actually suffer enormously. That's my contention, and I don't know how people feel about that. But is there anyone else who wants to say anything? Person there? Anyone else? Okay, well, person there for now, yeah.
Frank, I had a slight disagreement, I think. I can see your point that there's a lot at stake, obviously, with the this kind of attack on intimacy and the kind of claims of suspicion surrounding intimate relationships. But surely it touches obviously a profound marker of the intimate. So I'm not certain about a response that says, yeah, there's more than one way to skin a cat, there are other pedagogical techniques that could be employed, because it seems to be conceding the point. I'm just concerned about that.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else? A bit nervous. That gentleman there. Sorry. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Stevens from Classical Music Magazine, but not on their behalf, obviously. It just occurs to me that it's so much about power relationships, and videos like that seem to suggest that teachers now feel like almost students have more power, when quite obviously in the past the power was far too much the other way. It's that simple, really.
Oh yes, you want to. Sorry, you want to speak? Yeah.
Yeah, just a quick point. There's an understandable defensiveness amongst a number of people on the panel, given the character of the debate. But I just wondered whether, following on from some of Piers' points earlier, I like the way you talked about the positive aspect of touching, and I wondered whether, in developing a counter-narrative, if that could be part of the debate, that might help teachers to feel more comfortable with their relationships, because I mean that's just not out there at the moment. We'll probably get a lot of flack for it, but it'd be an important part of the debate, I think.
Anyone want to pick anything up from the panel?
Yes, just on touching, you see, I actually I'm not a big believer in touching between adults and children, quite regardless of all this thing, because it's got nothing to do with abuse, but children haven't got the confidence to be able to tell adults when they want to be touched and not touched. I mean, I'm sure that you must have had that experience when you were young. It could even be an uncle, people kind of, sort of feeling that they had the right to, sort of physically invade your space. And so, in general, I don't want to get involved in that discussion, not just from personal experience, but also because I think that's not the issue. I think the issue is emotion. It's about closeness, and I think that's what we are really, sort of trying to regulate. And it seems to me that I'm not a music teacher, but the most, I don't think the touching side of it is that critical. I think as in any area, it's the closeness. And as you're saying, it's the power relation that's the tricky one. Because you see, power is an interesting thing. Power can be used for good and for bad, right? And so I don't want to eliminate power relations, because I think as an academic, hopefully, on a good day, I use my power to encourage people to gain independence and, sort of become self-sufficient. I'm open to the possibility that on a bad day, I could be very backward and use my power to put people down. I mean, I'm sure that we all do those things sometimes. But it's the power. It's not the power that's the problem. It's basically making sure that our relationships, in the way that we kind of conduct them, is for worthy, progressive, kind of enlightened objectives. And it's not just about me as a teacher. And I think that once we understand those ground rules, that all of these other things can be very easily sort of dealt with our rules and regulation. And I think that it's expecting people in institutions to kind of work to a very high standard, you know, sort of where they don't confuse their own individual needs with their professional role as cultivating the intellectual or the artistic life of young people.
Okay, Tom wants to say something. Listen, we haven't, and Piers wants to say something. We're at the end, but if it's just one of those things where you're going to walk out this room and go, maybe you did want to ask that question, ask it. That's the point. Anyway, Tom.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many facets to this, and when I was organising my introduction, there's so much to put in and to leave out, but I'm just going to cover a few things, try to. I do agree with Frank about this, this ideal of touching the soul. I think that's true. I think it's difficult now, and I think it's more difficult now than when I started teaching. I don't know what it is, but certainly when I get a new student, there is certainly, and I've been teaching a while, hopefully have a good reputation, there is certainly a period now where you have parents with you and they really want to be absolutely secure and happy, and I would say that takes a good few months. The other thing which I'm seeing with younger students, and I do work a lot with young students, 6, 7, 8, is that they're much more aware. Compared to 10 years ago, they will come in and you can sort of just see it in their eyes. They really are checking the situation. You have to be very careful. And actually, you know, I'm a strong believer in terms of good teaching is not saying, observing and just being careful exactly what you say so that you're not bombarding them with everything. What's off limits? Well, a lot of things now, actually. I will, again, not say much. I won't really delve into personal life. You know, I will make comments about, you know, how's your weekend, how's school going, things like this, but I won't go into anything personal in that sense. Touching, I think hopefully the more experience you get as a teacher, and I'm a wind specialist, I don't think you need to touch. But I'm not saying that that is a complete, absolute no-no, because there are instances. For example, I had one of my new students a few weeks ago, she's 7, on the little C clarinet. No matter how many times I said, you've got to move your first finger, not your middle finger. She just didn't do it. She kept on moving her middle finger, and I just went, look, it's move this, and straight away. There are instances where you have to do that. But you know, another example I want to give is yesterday, this student, who's quite a character, said, I can play this from memory. And what she did was, she got her clarinet, went across to the wall, and faced the wall so that I couldn't see what she was doing, and played it perfectly, because this was her thing, and she wants to play it. Now, if someone would have come through that, just looked through that door, they'll have seen a student with a clarinet facing the wall, me again on the piano, and they'll have thought, well, what on earth is he doing, having her stood there, facing the wall, playing? It's a minefield, and so there has to be some common sense, and unfortunately, common sense isn't common anymore.
Thank you, Tom. Please.
I just wanted to say that while so many of the terrible the terrible historical things, historical current things, can be changed by the kind of good practice that we've heard about. I think the really difficult thing for the future is that some of the abuse comes not from a lack of windows into practice rooms, but actually windows into the self of some of the abusers. I said earlier that it's not just a matter of the touching issue, but it goes much more widely. And I think that so often the cases that can damage people forever simply come down to the kind of person that a highly reputable musician, who may be justifiably well known, the kind of person that they are, and they're simply being themselves in this. And I think that's just what makes it so difficult. And the story I wanted to mention was that quite a few years ago, I knew a much older American composer whose whole life had really been changed by studying with a very well-known figure, Paul Hindemith, at Yale University, and musicians are usually rather rude about Hindemith because of his facility, and produced a lot of music very quickly. But they should really be more rude about him as a teacher, really, because this had an effect on his teaching. And what this person told me was that he would go along with the kind of miserable fragment that people usually take along to sessions, you know, having started something and then not sure what to do with it. And Hindemith's room had a blackboard on all 4 sides of it, so imagine it's square, and it ran round all 4 sides of the wall, and he would look at it and say, okay, let's, yeah, well, you started this idea, okay, well, that's good, it's fine. Then, you know, put it in the piano here, and then, you know, why wouldn't you sort of continue it there, and we go on. And the next thing, he'd be on to the second wall, and he basically wrote the piece while this chap was sitting in there. And one of the problems that young composers have is kind of, you know, flow. You know, it's kind of making a plausible narrative, as it were. And so he's presented with this chap who had no problems about that, whatever else problematic in his music. And it destroyed him, really, the kind of confrontation with plausible flow, which was the one, instead of developing strategies for him to kind of, to try, you know, how could you generate where this goes next, he did that. And as a result, the person became a jazz composer, really, but he said that everything, what he had become as a composer was directly a result of that. And we would now think of that as an abusive relationship. Although, obviously, it wasn't that Hindemith didn't care or anything. He probably thought he was being helpful. And it was how he was, and I think that is really intractable.
Okay, thanks. Any final thoughts on the floor? Or are we at the end? Okay. Yeah, no, I'm going to bring, oh no, you'll get your final, don't worry. I just wanted to make sure there was no one else out there. I wanted to, Panel left. Well, I'll say a couple of things. I suppose one of the things that strikes me as being important, just to reflect on kind of leaving this session, is I have to say that I'm reflecting on your question about what's the limit emotionally. One of the things that's quite difficult is, practically everything that I have gone on to do in my life, of which I am pleased, if you know what I mean, I wouldn't have got very far if I hadn't had adults who'd really put a lot of effort into making me have breakthroughs when I was young, if that makes sense. Took the time. I'm passionate and love literature because I was kind of that was initiated in me by someone else. Do you see what I mean? And I was kind of like hopeless and not interested, and then somebody made me. I can imagine that could be seen as like not abusive, but And then, of course, what I was going to say was when you fall passionately in love with something like literature or a piece of music or all the rest of it, and you associate it with the tutor that's done it, there's inevitably some kind of a messiness. I just want us to be honest about this, right? If anyone hasn't experienced that, then that's sad, because it's actually one of life's joys, but it's not black and white. And it's therefore, obviously, there is a responsibility with any teacher not to take advantage of that, but it's not to say that it's awful when it happens. An emotionless, passionless relationship with a tutor might pass muster with some people, but not a lot's going on. It's not very lively, you know what I mean? It's not going to be life-affirming or life-changing. But obviously life is messy, so that seems to me to be... So my answer is, there are no limits, because you'd want it to be the most intense emotional relationship. And it's almost like as my ballet teacher was kind of almost like in these days she'd have been locked up, but when I did ballet, she fair bit of whacking and pulling legs and all the rest of it. But she was one of the women who inspired me to imagine that I could be a different kind of woman as well, right? When I was like 7 and 11 and 4. So I think these are what makes us human and is the most inspiring thing. So my concern is if those things are always seen, or we increasingly see those as either off limits or somehow dubious. That misanthropy is what I'm worried about. Okay, I now appear to have spoken longer than anyone, and the person is trying to wire me up. And the one person hasn't returned to the chair, but I'll give everyone a chance to make their final remarks. So, Piers, last final thought, really, that you want to kind of share with us. I'll just move along, and we'll see if I can arrive back.
I think in the end, a sort of positive way forward will be the because people undergo, people have a different attitude, and we do now, I hope, but I don't think we will move forward until we really confront how awful these things have been. I mean, I think often when there are big social changes, there is, there's a tendency to say, well, we're not like that now, and it couldn't, etc. And that, well, hopefully, is true, but I sort of think the profession does need to stand up and say just how wrong and appalling this was. I mean, I'm not. I don't think it's helpful to, in a way, to kind of debate. Even if it was terrible for one or two people, it was something that is completely inimical to the training of music, which is such a sacred thing. And so I sort of feel there has to be, we do need to kind of face, how wicked this has been and how painful.
Thanks, Liz. Heather?
Well, to broaden from music to abuse more generally, I'd say that the only way forwards is in the middle ground. It isn't in the arguments at the extremes. So we're not going to make any sensible progress if we're always talking about how dreadful it was and how many people are abused, and that has to be dealt with as part of the policy for what we do next. And similarly, to pretend there isn't abuse at all and abuse doesn't matter, it doesn't take us anywhere. So the conversations need to be had in the middle ground, and the middle ground is often a bit messy, as Claire has described, and messiness is important in intelligent debate, I think. But I think the music world isn't in a bubble, and any policy changes won't be about music, it'll be about everybody. And we already have considerable policies that address all of the concerns everybody is in expressing concerns have. The problem is that maybe some people haven't been following them, but we do have them. So, we clearly need other sorts of conversations, I think.
Okay, thanks. Tom?
Yeah, I think absolutely right that now the allegations are out and people have been waiting for so long, obviously, for the instances of abuse at Chet's, for example, to come out, then that absolutely should be thoroughly investigated, and the people responsible for that brought to bear and all of this. I hope that we are living now in a more enlightened profession, and certainly are after all these allegations have been exposed. But that certainly does need to have its time, so I don't think anyone's suggesting that. In terms of teaching, for me, it does come down to the quality of the teaching. It is about the music, and certainly the limits are very close when you start off with any pupil. As you progress, as the relationship increases and the trust develops, then those limits widen. And I think that's what it's about. But I do hope, and I do agree with Frank, that this sense of touching the soul and these insecurities in society now can lessen, so that there is a little bit more freedom and this sense of relationships can form more easily.
Thank you very much, Tom. Sue?
I absolutely agree about touching the soul. I think that it's adults who are responsible for students, whether they're young children or they're adults. I've had students of all ages develop what I could see as developing relationships which I didn't think were totally healthy, and then having to be very careful how I took that forward so that they didn't become totally out of hand. So I think adults have to take responsibility, but I think that institutions have to take responsibility for what is going on in their institution. Most staff are fine, there's no problem, it's great, but it only needs one person can do a lot of damage to a lot of children or young adults. And institutions need to take that seriously, and just whatever's happened, and whatever accusations are flying about, it seems to me that the institutions involved here did not really carry out their responsibilities as they should have done.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Frank?
Yeah, I'm sorry for popping out, it's like cramp had to go out. I think that the problem, there is no real solution to a lot of problems, but there is one thing that we can all do, which is that we need to have a culture where we commit ourselves to the fact that everything is discussable within an institutional environment, and there's no issues that cannot be brought out into the open by everybody concerned, so that that's seen as being not just something you do on the weekend, but every single day you're able to sort of give a voice to whatever you feel needs to be said, and that nothing is unsayable. I think that's a really important point. And the reason why I emphasize this is because I don't think that policies work. I think policies have a very nasty habit of inviting even more policies, and it creates its own imperative. And I don't think that procedure, you know, sort of, and governance, which is what we're always opting for, is a substitute for the kind of intelligent and sort of and kind of open-minded, tolerant environment that we need to create, because those things are built upon informal interaction. They're built upon the kind of the dense network of social capital that we create within an institution, and that is destroyed ultimately by our rules. Right? And I do think that the moment what we're doing is just making a lot of rules in relation to this, in the hope that that will put things right. And my own fear is that that just simply, you know, sort of leads to the micromanagement of all of our existence in ways that are actually unhelpful. And anybody that works in a university will know what I'm talking about, where with the massive rise in accountability, you know, sort of, I thought this was an interesting discussion just from some of the reactions that people made, and certainly, you know, it seems to me that, you know, these are accounting that we just got to really bring that in the open, not after the event, but all the time, so that we are not caught off unaware in the way that we sometimes are.
Thank you, everyone. I think the thing that people who are particularly interested in music schools should remember, that there's been those kind of situations that are not mythical, of teaching unions instructing their members not to put sun cream on primary school teachers for fear of it being misinterpreted, and then as a consequence school trips being banned, and a kind of set of risk-averse, you know, kids not being allowed out because then they might get sunburnt, but nobody will put the cream on. I think that's really the kind of context in which, and John Bridcutt made the point, so just to bear in mind, to follow on from just some of the things that were said, that sometimes music teachers, any teachers, or the person that a student will also go to develop a relationship with, will also tell things that they wouldn't tell anyone else. And so we have to ensure that if we're going to have an atmosphere of open discussion in music schools moving forward, then kind of making kids scared of adults and adults scared of kids isn't necessarily going to be a result that we want, or with everyone with a standoff. So whatever way goes forward, that won't be a healthy outcome. But thank you all very much for brilliant contributions from the panel. You know, not people didn't agree, which is perfectly acceptable, but actually really interesting to hear the different perspectives that actually developed throughout it. And thank you as an audience for your contributions as well. Particularly difficult session, well handled everyone. Thank you very much.